Okay, now, ladies and gentlemen, we are going to go to the final panel discussion of the day on how can we help better food migration and climate change, which is a very nice segue, I think, from what Deputy Minister Beck just discussed with us. So I would invite my speakers now to join me on the podium. That's Dr. Claudia Sadoff, Katharina Stenholm. I have Richard Heath in the middle, Žiga Vavpotič, second from the end, and then Ted Bilyea right at the end. So please be seated, and I would invite, ladies and gentlemen, to give my panellists a very warm round of applause. So yes, Ted, you're at the end, exactly that. Okay, great. Well, welcome. Thank you for your patience. We're back on track, I think, and we'll run with this session until 4:30, which is respecting the timetable that we had already set. So by way of introduction, I would like to welcome Dr. Claudia Sadoff, who is the Executive Managing Director of CGIAR, the world's largest network of agri-food focused research centres. Claudia served as the Director General of the International Water Management Institute, the IWMI, a CGIAR centre headquartered in Sri Lanka, working globally to find water solutions for sustainable, climate-resilient development. Next, we have Katharina Stenholm, who is a Senior Vice President and Chief Sustainability Officer at PepsiCo Europe, which is one of our supporting partners here at the Forum. Katharina is a member of the PepsiCo Europe leadership team and also works as an executive coach. Originally from Finland, she holds a doctorate of technology and biotechnology and a master's in chemical engineering from Helsinki University of Technology. Then we have Richard Heath, who is Executive Director of the Australian Farm Institute, which is one of the Forum's international partners. Prior to joining the AFI team, Richard was Associate Professor of Agronomy and Farm Management at the University of Sydney. Before that, was involved in a large family farming business, putting words in my mouth there, in northwest New South Wales. Richard is a Nuffield Scholar and previously served as Director of Nuffield Australia. Next, we have Žiga Vavpotič, who is Director of Partnerships at LoginEko and Special Advisor at the Login Foundation. Žiga is an experienced international manager and leader and is the former chairman of Outfit 7 Limited. Has my mic dropped? Okay, I need a new mic, or I need a handheld mic as soon as possible. So, Renaud is on the case. Merci, Renaud. Merci beaucoup. Okay, I'm going to trust the sound technician. Thank you, Renaud. So as I said, Žiga describes himself as a responsible, goal-oriented change maker by connecting knowledge from business and non-profit, fostering cross-cultural cooperation with a focus on China and Europe, and creating projects and organizations for social change. I think Žiga would describe himself as a newcomer, so we're going to look forward to your intervention in a moment. And last but by no means least, we have Ted Bilyea, who is a Distinguished Fellow in Strategic Trade at the Canadian Agri-Food Policy Institute, one of the Forum's international partners. Previously, Ted served as President of Maple Leaf Foods International and led the largest exporter of food in Canada. I believe we'll be hearing a lot more about Maple Leaf Foods in a moment, Ted. And you also served as a board member for several global food companies and was inducted, interestingly, into the Canadian Agriculture Hall of Fame in 2018. And I hope that there's a European equivalent, because I hope to be inducted myself by the end of today. So a very warm welcome to you all. And please, ladies and gentlemen, give my panelists a very warm round of applause. Now, as you see, the clock is ticking, so I would ask my technical team to change that to 4-minute interventions. I'm a tough taskmaster, as you can see. So, Claudia, you have 4 minutes to make your introductory remarks. Then we'll open it up to the floor, and we'll get a conversation going until 4:30. So please, take it away, Claudia.
Thank you so much, Rose, and good afternoon to everyone. As mentioned, I work with CGIAR, which is the largest publicly funded organization of research centers that really work to transform food, land, and water systems in a climate crisis. Our focus is on equipping farmers, small-scale farmers and partners in the global south in order to provide food and nutrition security sustainably for all. In recent years, the shocks that we've been talking about here today have made that an incredibly difficult and challenging mission. And a lot of the real burden of those challenges falls on those small-scale farmers that we serve who are on the front line of those specific shocks. You know, the world has made tremendous progress until about 2015 in battling hunger and malnutrition. Even before COVID, though, we suddenly started to see hunger and malnutrition rising. Then COVID and the war added another 150 million in food insecurity to those numbers. And what we're seeing now, the topic here, is that actually war and conflict have become the most important drivers for for food insecurity and for migration. In 2030, the World Bank estimates that 2/3 of the extreme poor will live in fragile, affected contexts. And evidence suggests that this outsized role that is played by wars and conflict will only continue. 80% of the 84 million people who are forcibly displaced suffer from acute food insecurity and very high levels of malnutrition. So you look at these numbers, you look at these trends, and you think that the whole challenge is just absolutely overwhelming. But it is not insurmountable, and I thought we heard that this morning from Frans Timmerman. If we reverse these trends, the end of hunger really is still achievable as an SDG by 2030. However, at the same time that we've been seeing hunger and malnutrition rise, we've been seeing investment in agriculture in low-income countries decline in the same period. In fact, we see that about a $14 billion a year shortfall in aid that is estimated to be needed to end hunger continues. We also see that in the wake of all these successive shocks, a real shift into humanitarian assistance in food, which is, and unfortunately probably always will be, essential. But what we also need is we need real investment in research and innovation to serve small-scale farmers and the global food systems so that we can break out of this cycle, this real cycle of crisis and response and move forward. And it's this sort of resilience, innovation and resilience that the CGIAR works toward. We work toward creating climate-resilient and yield-enhancing crop varieties. We work to improve food and soil management practices and policies. We biofortify crops to promote healthy human development, and we develop technologies and digital tools to provide farmers with the information and the data that they need to protect and act for themselves. In addition, we're also beginning to build evidence on how to support policies and programming specifically in areas that are conflict and fragile affected in order to promote more social equity, community resilience, conflict mitigation, and peace building as well. So what we see is that there are science-based solutions out there. They're ready to be refined, they're ready to be adapted, they need to be scaled up. But with investment in research and innovation, with urgency and with partnership, we actually can achieve an end to world hunger, and we can build these resilient and equitable, sustainable food systems that we need in Europe and globally as well.
Thank you for that, Claudia. Thank you for that, Claudia, and thank you for sticking to the time allocated. And we will return to their big topics there. Very prevalent, very, very topical. And I suppose that these are big ticket items that we really should be focusing on. And as you say, even more pressing now in the last 18 months or so, particularly in the last 12 months, as you say. So Katharina Stenholm, then please, PepsiCo's perspective on the matter.
Thank you. Really happy to be here, and should perhaps start by highlighting why is PepsiCo talking at an agricultural conference. Most of you perhaps connect us to beverages. We are actually a bigger producer of savory snacks than we are of beverages. Our snacks business is fed by 7 million acres globally, out of which 2 million acres in Europe. So that's really our connection to agriculture and the food value chain. I just wanted to give you a perspective on what fixing tomorrow, today, means in the context of an FMCG. So we have a program that we call PepsiCo Positive, which is really an end-to-end transformation where we need to rethink not only how we do things, but starting even with what we do, what type of products we put on the market. So that's our pillar that we call Positive Choices, where we really look at reformulating our products to be able to offer consumers a healthier choice. We have a commitment to have 500 million of healthier snacks out there in the market by 2025, with an aspiration to grow it to 1 billion in sales. This then is fed by the pillar that we call positive agriculture. So those 2 million acres, we have committed to transition to regenerative agriculture. We are doing great progress in what we call our key crops, potatoes, corn, and oats, where we work directly with farmers, so where we have an opportunity to then directly contract long-term, put the right incentives in place. I think our next challenge is with what we call supplier-sourced crops, where we now need our suppliers to step in and help us to access all those farmers that we don't have direct access to. And then last but not least is our positive value chain. So that's then we have access to this fantastic material coming from the regenerative agriculture. Now we need to use them in the most resource efficient way to create the healthier products. Just to give you a couple of examples, you would obviously probably all think about renewable energy to reduce our carbon footprint, but we're also doing things that you would perhaps not immediately think of. So for example, a potato has a much higher moisture content than the potato chips that is leaving the factory. That water, we are looking into technologies to capture and reuse in the factory. So really looking at a very water efficient plant. We have one in Mexico that is already running since closer to a year with no additional water coming in as fresh water, because it's a totally circular closed system. We are also looking at when we take the potatoes, we peel them. Those potato peels are converted into a fertilizer that we bring back to the potato field for the next crop. So again, an example of a very resource-efficient circular economy. All of this we can't do alone. I think collaboration is something that we have spoken a lot about during the day. And I won't reiterate what we said about collaboration, about public-private. There are kind of two levels or two areas of collaboration I would like to call out, though. One is, I think, collaboration across generations. If we want to fix tomorrow today, I really think we need to give the people who are going to live tomorrow a voice today within our companies, allow them to advise us how we need to think about how we run our businesses. And I do think I would like to close with calling out also the farmers, because I really appreciate what Eva was saying. She wants to be empowered to do the right things. Farmer knows what they need to do on the farm. We are here to support. We should bring in solutions, but that's... So a voice from the future. With that, I will close.
Okay, we might just wrap that up there, Katharina, if you don't mind. Thank you, Katharina, for that. And there is an opportunity afterwards to ask questions. You're free to make your points known. We would appreciate if you just raise your hand and ask that question. Okay, so we'll follow on now. If you don't mind, Richard, please take the floor.
Thanks, Rose. I might start by saying that agricultural conferences in Australia are far less interesting than they are here. It's been quite an introduction to the European experience, but I might start with the Australian context around food security. And we do have quite a different one in Australia, given that we are an entirely export-dependent agricultural economy. Last year, the value of our agricultural economy was $90 billion. We exported 75 billion of that. So virtually everything that we grow, the value of everything that we grow, goes to providing food security to others. So a really important part of that global food security in the Australian context is trade, international trade, unencumbered trade. But we do understand that one of the main reasons that we are always going to need trade, as much as we understand that we need to boost local food systems and we need to have stronger local food systems and produce food locally. The fact of the climate crisis and the impact of the climate crisis means that we are always going to be experiencing shortages of food for short periods in local regions, even bigger regions from time to time. I agree with some of the earlier speakers that have talked about the hyperbole around running out of food altogether. That's not going to happen. We have an abundance of food, but we are going to have short-term shortages of food due to climate impact all over the place. So we're going to always need food trade as part of food security. And so Australia's role in doing that, and in fact any exporting country's role in providing that food security through trade, is really dependent on unencumbered, unrestricted trade. But that climate impact we have to recognise in making sure that what we export is produced responsibly, is produced sustainably, so we're not continuing to add to that climate crisis. And that is where I think in Australia we have, again, a different approach in that we are very much outcomes focused. We are much less looking to solve the climate crisis by attaching labels to what we do. We are much more interested in delivering outcomes. Our beef industry has a carbon neutral by 2030 target. We're not delivering that through saying all beef farmers must be regenerative. We're delivering that through saying we must understand how to measure the outcomes of every beef farm, whether that's biodiversity, whether that's carbon, whether that's water, whether that's animal welfare, all the things that go towards sustainability. I found the discussion in this conference, to be frank, around labels, around organic, around regenerative, quite distracting. Some of the best farmers I know in the world are organic. Some of the worst farmers I know, the most environmentally destructive, are organic. Some of the most degenerative farmers I know call themselves regenerative. You don't make yourself a good farmer by attaching a label to what you do. You make yourself a good farmer by being a good farmer. And so the quicker that we can move towards getting the R&D, the research and development, getting the metrics, getting the understanding about what we need to deliver as outcomes from every farm, and then move towards rewarding those outcomes, incentivising those outcomes, however they are produced, whatever label you want to call yourself, then I think that is the quickest way that we can fix tomorrow today.
Thank you very much, Richard, and for your concise approach and also bringing that perspective, as you say, from the Australian Farm Institute and ending on a very pragmatic note, I would say. So now we have Žiga, Vavpotič. I practiced that last night, Žiga. You're bringing a totally different voice to this forum today. You said last night at the speakers' dinner that you felt like a newcomer to the discussion. So we're looking forward to you and to hearing your experience in the field and also your involvement in digital precision farming and how that is working with this farm that you explored in more detail in Serbia. So please, Žiga, I won't give anything else away. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. There is really always a story behind every story, but before I address it as a newcomer, I need to be honest with you, because agriculture is quite new. And yes, I agree, it's way more fun than mobile games. I was before in the mobile games, but you know, nothing like this happened there. But honestly, I need also to admit that the topic is very complex, you know, and whatever I'll say, I know that I'll make half of the audience being my great friends and fun, but on the other hand, you know, half of the audience will hate me. Because, you know, when you just say organic, and you say that we should reach 25% organic in Europe, half of the audience is applauding, and when someone is saying this is not possible, the other half. So I would say that it looks like that the topic is very complex. So what is our story and why we are connected with the mobile games? So there is a couple in Slovenia who founded Outfit 7, famous Talking Tom. They sold the company for $1 billion, and instead of enjoying their time in Hawaii, they said what we can do in sense of sustainability. So they bought 4,000 hectares of land in Serbia, and they said, we want to be farmers. So they didn't want to be just philanthropists giving money away, but they really said, we want to do farming in a bit different way. what was the first thing that we tried to be different is for sure digitalization. We heard a lot about digitalization today, but what we really do is we have a big team that is actually providing and doing our own software. Because when we browse what is there out, we've figured out that there is no really great solution for large-scale farming. So we're often saying that we are probably a farm with the biggest software development, or we are a software developer company with our own farming. So about half of the team from 200 people are working in software development. And the benefit is that whatever we will create, and hopefully in about a year we will be out, we'll give to any farming company or farmers around the world for free, because it's a philanthropic idea behind. Of course, we are there also, and we are organic farm, so we try to find a way how we can provide healthy food for everyone in a way that we will harm Mother Earth in the least possible way. Because at one point we will need to admit that maintaining today's food production methods threaten tomorrow's food security. And honestly, no one at the moment is there yet that we would be able to say whatever we produce, even us trying our best, we can be really sustainable. It's only the question how much time we are buying for scientific people that we will really hack at one point the way how we can really produce the food in the right way. On the other hand, we try to come close also to customers, to consumers. So we are launching a product, a meal in the bottle, end of the year, which will consist later on also from our products, but which will be traceable, because we really want to bring traceability to the food chain. And on the other hand, we want to be there for also the policymakers with solutions. So we try to be the person who is coming around the table with solution, with partners, because, you know, when you're new to the school and when you're coming to 6th grade in the middle of the year, you can either be a badass or smartass, and we don't want to be seen like that, but we really want to be seen as a partners to anyone who is in the room.
Thank you very much, Žiga, and we look forward to teasing out some of those details in a moment. So now, Ted, to you, thanks for your patience. Ted Bilyea, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you very much. I thought I would just take a minute and tell you a short story about a company in Canada that's trying to become essentially carbon neutral. And they've actually announced that they are as of 2019. But it's Maple Leaf Foods, public company, so everything I'm saying is available on public disclosure documents. They began investing in both Scope 1, Scope 2, obviously taking those down to zero. But Scope 3, which is the farming side, became the more difficult issue. And what they did there, they were able to work with their farmers to bring some of that down, but they neutralized the rest of it by buying credits, but very high valued credits. Now the interesting thing for that is it puts the farmer in a position where saying, you know what, here's the money that you can all have as soon as we work together to bring as much of Scope 3 down as possible. So it's a bit of a target that's laid out there. There's 2 points I'll raise on the Scope 3 that, and I'll use their pork business for an example there, that it would interest us from different reasons. One is the first one was the manure issue. And the question there was, okay, how do you deal with that? And as you heard Stephanie Beck say, I didn't know she was going to say this, that the Canadian government is investing both in the research around that, they've got a lot of going on, and in the reactors as well. But you have to be pretty big to be able to use one of those if you're a farmer in the pork side. But nevertheless, that's going ahead, and the only issue there is why farmers wouldn't be investing themselves in that, is that just as Richard said, Canada is also a big exporter. We're not quite as big in percentage of how much we export as Australia, but we're big too. And the issue is that trade has been very tough. Geopolitical barriers have knocked us completely out of some markets, and non-tariff and tariff barriers have knocked us out of others, even markets where we have trade agreements. And so the farmer can't afford to take the risk to put the technology in place, and that's why the government's trying to backstop some of that. The other one that I think is room here knows very well is that, you know, when you feed animals, you need crops, and the crop issue, of course, is, you know, to do with how much fertilizer you're going to use. And there's been tremendous work in that area as well. But as Stephanie again said, the interesting thing, if you were listening there, was that, you know, we've doubled our agriculture production in the last 20 years, but we barely moved anything in terms of the emissions. And so there's a lot going on there, but the story behind that is quite interesting, and that's why maybe Maple Leaf's bet on Scope 3 might help, might come to pass. They won't have to pay it. But the story on that is quite simple. 25 or more years ago, lots of farmers in Western Canada began playing around with no-till. That's really one of the areas where it originated from. And they found, of course, what everybody else found, is it holds water, and if you're in a dry area, you get better yields. Well, roll the clock forward, you know, and you've got a situation where now suddenly we notice it's maintaining carbon as well. And all of a sudden that becomes the big deal. It's also, I think, we need to remember that I'll just take the largest producer of ag and food in the world, which is in a region, which is East Asia, by far the largest producer. They also doubled their production in the last 20 or so years, 25 years. But they did it in a much more carbon-intense manner. So their intensity ratios are off the charts comparatively. They also quadrupled their imports of food from everybody in this room and that participated. But some of the people that participated at very high rates with carbon, not the same. And so the problem that we have today is the problem that Richard raised, is that, you know, we have to figure out how we can, if we're going to feed this world properly, how we can manage to move these products from areas where they're relatively low intensity to areas where it will be high intensity, and not have high intensity moving back into low intensity, which I know is a worry for the EU. So that's, from a strategic point of view, I think that's one of the big issues. And the last one I will leave you with is the whole question of what do we do with the harmful subsidies, not good subsidies that are used for purposes, you know, that we're talking about here today, but there's a lot of harmful subsidies out there. And the issue there is we have, as you've heard earlier in the presentations, $800 billion a year being used across the globe, according to the OECD, on basically what would be support for agriculture each year. A portion of that money, you know, targeted at the right issues to bring down emissions, would do marvelous good. And being able to somehow align on some of that so we can continue to trade would be wonderful. So this conference, I think, is one of the best places where those kind of things can be figured out and worked out, and we can have a much better world for it. If you want two references, I'm finished, that are probably worth a good read. They were both published very recently, but the Brookings put out a long paper in the last week, which I highly recommend you look at. It was basically on the political economy reforming costly ag policy. Interesting read, as you know, from the Brookings. And the last one would be IFRI, also published a paper very recently on the, I think it was repurposing policies. And they both trying to get into the area that I'm talking about. They used the EU, the US, and India on the first one as examples of how not to go about it directly with the political issues arising. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Ted. Thank you for that. And good to draw on your experience, as you say, with the Maple Leaf Foods, and echo what Deputy Minister Stephanie Beck said earlier on in the session. I'm going to come back now to this end, to Claudia. Just picking up on some of the points made by the panellists, echoing words as well from Deputy Minister Beck. Migration is often triggered by climate change, something you mentioned yourself. Food Food security, though, is about income rather than food production. I mean, we have plenty of food in the world. It's not a question. It's access to food. It's being able to pay for that food. So what sort of strategies are in place, or on the basis of your work with CGIAR, what sort of outlooks are you looking at to maybe explore that in more detail?
Right. Well, food insecurity can, in many cases, be overcome by income security. If you have access to markets, if you have access to cash, a lot of the poorest communities are not cash rich. So you really have two aspects here. One aspect is to try to strengthen the livelihoods of farmers and farm communities so that, for example, during a climate shock, they can import. And in that case, we work quite a lot on value chains, and we work a lot on poverty and livelihoods. And we're working not just to keep subsistence farmers as strong subsistence farmers, but really create thriving livelihoods for them so they have those options. But in other cases, a lot of the shocks of climate can be overcome or resisted with more resilient agricultural policies. And and practices. We heard a lot of that from the just preceding panel in terms of water. We do a lot of breeding of crop varieties that are much more heat, drought, and flood tolerant. We work on agronomic practices that sustain greater soil moisture, small-scale irrigation, solar-powered irrigation, as well as the policies and practices that connect farmers and farm communities to markets. So there is a whole complex of issues that in some cases incomes can solve, in other cases incomes may not be able to solve, but working across the value chain and working on the basic resilience of farms and farm communities is something that is very important in the global south, where a lot of these shocks lead to migration.
Okay, and I'm going to come back to Richard in a moment to discuss resilient agriculture and picking up on the point that Claudia just made there. But first I'll turn to Katharina. You mentioned PepsiCo positive, but my question to you is, how can we persuade consumers, citizens, to change their diets towards these more intense natural resources, products that use a lot of resources from the earth? You mentioned there some of the products under your remit. So how can we influence consumers to make a shift and to change their spending habits?
Yeah, I think I like the change in the question from persuade to influence, because I think we heard earlier today, none of us want to be told what to do. We want to make choices for ourselves. And I think from FMCG's point of view, it really starts by making those healthier options available, so giving people access. And then I think it comes down very much to inspire people to do the right things. That is really what we do as branded goods companies. We have brands that inspire people. People buy the brands because they connect with what the brand stands for. And the more our brands can stand for those healthier choices, that brings smiles not only to the people, but also to the planet, to the environment. I think we are in a place where then through making the products available for the ones who want information, we have an obligation to have as much transparency, bring that information, but I don't believe in kind of force-feeding the information. I'm more in the space of inspiring through what we make available.
Okay, Katharina, thanks for that. Richard, looking at price shocks, and you're coming from the Australian perspective, last summer, the European Union, or in Europe, we witnessed a fairly severe drought, very high temperatures, which had a major impact on our yields. You're coming from a country which has to deal with climate shocks on a yearly, perhaps, biannual basis. Let's talk about resilience in your agricultural sector. What sort of work is your institute, the Australian Farm Institute, doing on that, and sort of building that resilience from the ground up?
So I think one of the most encouraging changes that's happened in understanding resilience in Australian agriculture over the last few years is the understanding of the social and governance side of sustainability. And that resilience just isn't about farming practice and making sure that you can continue to grow when there's a drought or you can deal with a flood. But the resilience is actually probably even more related to strong communities. It's related to strong regional economies. And that's why you're getting really interesting initiatives and investment from the likes of Syngenta and other companies into mental health initiatives in regional communities so that you make good decisions. when you're in times of climate crisis, when you're in the middle of a drought, that you're still able to make good decisions about what you're doing. The government's getting on board with that as well. And just regional health initiatives, good schools, all the sorts of things that make living in a regional area still attractive, even if everything is dead and it's the middle of a drought and everything seems hopeless, that there's still good community structure. And that understanding of what resilience actually is has made a huge difference to the way that we approach it in Australia.
Thank you, Richard. Now to Žiga, I'm quite curious about this farm in Serbia. Maybe you could tease out some of the detail, give us a little bit of an idea of who works there, what sort of crops you have. I believe there's no livestock, so that's quite interesting. And maybe a note as well on what you refer to as data-driven farming, perhaps in their precision elements. So you're coming from the tech side, but now you're engaged in some whether it's directly or indirectly, on this farm in Serbia, which is sort of a case, let's say. So please, go ahead.
So you need to understand that it's still a little bit in developing and trying phase, which is also a privilege that, you know, it's the logic of philanthropies behind. So I totally understand when people are saying, yes, but, you know, come back when everything will work out. And I totally understand that, but it's our privilege that we can test different things. And honestly, we know that at the point we will need to be profitable if we want that others will do it as well. But when you're asking, at the moment we are with the crops, vegetables. We are just starting now. Yes, it's no livestock manure, so we do a lot with green manuring. We are testing different things, and hopefully till end of the year we'll be able to put out what we have learned in sense of the green manuring. We have a lot of people in the data department, so we are observing things, measuring data. Drones are flying around, because when we were looking what is going on with the data in agriculture, we found out that, you know, we are for sure not using it enough. If you look around the world today, everyone is talking about ChatGPT, how this will change the society, and the question is where the agriculture is. But of course, you know, if you need to deal with so many other things and still need to be profitable and need to find, you know, the every season solutions, then you don't have the privilege that you can risk as much as we can, that you can try different things, and hopefully at about the end of the year we'll be ready, that we will be willing to test also in other climate conditions and try new things with other partners as well. But it's a lot of fun, but on the other hand, it's also the regular farm that is going on. So we are doing yields. We are having about testing probably about 70 different crops. So we do different, you know, trials, and we try to hack the system.
Thanks. We look forward to hearing an update on that, Žiga, in due time. Ted, I'm going to give you maybe an unenviable task to maybe wrap up this session, and then we'll go to question and answers from the audience. Just to look at the broad question that was put on the table. How can we help better food migration and climate change? Migration has been mentioned here, food security has been mentioned here, climate resilience, building a resilient food system, a food production system. You said yourself that Canada has doubled production with very little or no impact on GHG emissions. So if you could draw that all together, that would be great. Thank you.
I think that may be a bigger question than anybody can draw together. But I do believe that it's important to get on with it, to start. And that's why I used the Maple Leaf example. It may not be perfect, but at least they've taken a shot at it. And then when you start down that track, the next thing is that government needs to look at the problems that they can actually solve in dealing with. So you could, each one of you could figure out, if I was going to do this, would that help? And so I would keep it very, to start off with, I'd keep it very practical and think about the practical things that need to be done and what you could do to support it. And the last thing I would say is that, just to maybe Richard and I have said it already, We need a world that actually works on the trade front. So when you do get problems, as Richard said, we don't have them every day. But boy, we're living in a world where we can expect them more often. And when that happens, you have to have all of your supply chain working all the time. You don't want to have geopolitical disruptions or any other kind. Remember, the food supply chain is not just food, it's all the other things in it. It's all the processing, it's all the people that work in it, it's the movement of all your ships and things like that. And when things began to fall apart, it wasn't just the food system, it was all those other parts that really came into play and weren't working for a long time.
Last word, what's your reaction to the juggernaut that is the IRA south of the border in the United States? It was the IRA as in the Inflation Reduction Act and not the IRA that I might be more familiar with back home. But Ted, in terms of dealing with or impacting the economy of Canada, the federal budget is due today, I understand, in your country. And just a word on that maybe, and how that's going to impact your production system going forward.
You should have asked Stephanie that question when she was up.
I know, but she's just gone her now. So.
But you know, we live close to the U.S. and our largest trading partner is the U.S. And so whatever happens in the U.S. affects us for sure, all the time. I suspect, but don't know, that there was some kind of a mini IRA today in Canada announced. I have no idea what it is, but I can tell you that policy is terribly important because a couple of words here or there can change everything. In the US one, I understand that suddenly if a vegetable oil seed is produced in Canada and shipped in the United States, and crushed in the United States, it may not produce a subsidy that the US bean, or in this case canola seed, would produce. That means that several plants in Canada that are being built are now for renewable diesel may be in trouble unless that could be sorted out. Because we normally have everything going back and forth, with no duties and no subsidies supposedly affecting it. So I don't know the answer to your question because I haven't seen what happened today, but I do know my colleague from the US here, maybe she's on top of it better than me. This is going to be we've got a long way to go, let's say, with both the IRA and all the fallout from it. But let's hope that it does move us into a better world, because there's a lot of money being spent, so let's hope it's spent well.
Thank you, Ted, for that. Thanks for that response. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we have a couple of minutes to open it up to the floor. If there are some questions, please raise your hands. And, okay, Ariel. Get a microphone over to Ariel, please. Ariel Brunner, BirdLife International.
Thank you. For a change, a question not about Europe. It's for Richard. You've presented a very happy view of Australian farming. We had earlier from a Brazilian speaker some rather, I think, honest assessment of the challenges of deforestation and environment in Brazil. Now, Australia has the worst deforestation rate in the world, driven to a massive extent by agriculture, mainly by cattle farming, which is quite shocking for such a rich country. Usually, deforestation, we tend to think, is because of countries are poor and badly run. What's going on in Australia, it's been actually getting worse consistently. You somehow didn't mention it at all. Also, in terms of water, well, the only real river you have in the country is dead, with fish boiling in it. And part of the story is climate change, but the bigger part of the story is relentless extraction of water for agriculture, bad mismanagement, and in the very last die-out from the last few weeks, the massive runoff of nutrients from over-fertilized farms. It's interesting stuff that I was missing in your intervention. Thank you.
Sure. So first, deforestation. Deforestation is a label. And by that, I mean there are all sorts of things that come under the very broad term of deforestation. Now, in the statistics about deforestation in Western Queensland and northern New South Wales that you're referring to, it's most often referring to clearing of woody weed regrowth, right? So woody weeds. Now, if it's managed responsibly, and again, I say, being a good farmer is how you become a good farmer. So this takes good management. If that land is managed responsibly, there is lots of science now to show that by clearing those woody weeds and having proper regenerative grasslands in there that are well managed, that are responsibly grazed through rotational grazing practices, the carbon outcome is better than leaving those woody weeds to regrow. There is a positive sustainability story out of that. Now, I'm not going to claim that is the case for every hectare of land that's being cleared. Certainly not. It is always down to good practice and good science. We've heard today so often about we need to understand the science and let the science talk. There is good science around managing that country with regenerative grazing practices and grasslands and grazing that is a better carbon outcome and a better sustainability outcome than letting woody weeds regrow. On the river systems, the Murray-Darling Basin, yeah, no question. There are huge issues with over-allocation, historic over-allocation of water out of the Murray-Darling Basin system. The difficulty with fixing that is the Australian reality that has always happened pre-European civilisation, pre-agriculture. Those river systems dried up. And again, there's lots of science, there's lots of historical evidence that we just have such a variable climate in Australia that our biggest river systems would often not reach the ocean. They would dry up from lack of rain, and you'd have fish kills there. So fish kills, we've always had them. And again, I'm not suggesting for a minute that we shouldn't be trying to avoid it, that agriculture doesn't have a role to play in fish kills now. But just assuming that there's fish kills now is only a consequence of agriculture and only a consequence of modern systems is just wrong, that the science doesn't back up.
Okay, thank you for that, Richard. If I could get a mic over here, there's a gentleman with his hand up in this section of the room with the brown jacket, please. Can I get a mic over here, please? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Gottlieb Pasch from the European Conservation Agriculture Federation. I just wanted to comment on the very great achievement of Canadian agriculture, which, doubled production without increasing greenhouse gas emissions. And I think, first I wanted to ask how they achieved this, but that actually mentioned that the application and the use of no-till practices and conservation agriculture was able to contribute to carbon sequestration. And when it comes to tap on the potential of European soils, I think we really must enhance conservation agriculture as well here if we want to tackle climate change mitigation as well as adaptation, to store more water in the soil and to increase our carbon figures in our soils. So thank you very much, Ted, for this. And hopefully, right now, Europe is still a developing continent when it comes to the application of conservation agriculture, but hopefully we get there as well. Thank you.
Ted, do you want to respond to that?
I'd just like to thank the gentleman for that, but I'd also add that I left out a few other things we did along the way, which are things that we've learned as much from Europe as ourselves. But we do a lot, we've increased rotations as well by throwing in peas and beans and lentils in Western Canada. Eastern Canada is a lot more like Western Europe. It's like we have two countries. We have West and the East, and most of our agriculture by volume is in the West. And so that's why I gave you that example. But the Eastern agriculture looks a lot like it does around here. And in the East, we've had to use some other things because sometimes the no-till doesn't work in the East. But we have done a lot of cover cropping in Eastern, and again, more rotations. And that seems to have had some of that effect.
Okay, thank you for that, Ted. Well, I'm conscious of time now because we are running out of time at this session. So I'm going to wrap it up here. I'm going to thank my speakers, Dr. Claudia Sadoff, Katharina Stenholm, Richard Heath, Žiga Vavpotič, and Ted Bilyea. Thank you all very much as well for taking part.